Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce our today's speaker, Anna Genina. She is a doctoral candidate in cultural anthropology at the University of Michigan. So it's an exciting event to have our own local speaker and our own graduate student to give a talk for Greece. She has been researching issues of Kazakh diaspora and the migration of Kazakhs from Mongolia to Kazakhstan, and has conducted her ethnographic fieldwork with Mongolian Kazakh repatriates in the Almaty region in Kazakhstan. Her research focuses on movements, kinship, and hospitality as central to the conceptions and practices of belonging and identification among Kazakhs in Inner Asia. So please join me in welcoming Anna to our Greece Noon series lectures, and I'm really interested in hearing your talk, and I think I'm not alone.
Hi, thank you for such a nice introduction. Hello, everyone. My presentation today is, everyone can hear me okay, yeah? My presentation today is titled Claiming Ancestral Homeland. Sorry, let me just get of course the computer has to freeze. Claiming Ancestral Homeland, Mongolian Kazakh Migration in Inner Asia. And it's based on my current research, so still very much thoughts in progress. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your feedback. I'm just trying to get it to the... It's not really a big deal right now.
Usually it's...
Sorry about that. I'm going to try and see if I can get this back on track.
You still hear USB drive in?
I'm going to start talking and see if we could reopen this again. I don't really need the PowerPoint at this point. So I wanted to start with telling a story from my first trip to Kazakhstan, which happened all the way back in the summer of 2004 in my first year of graduate school. And through a confluence of sort of odd events, which involved various people in Ann Arbor, in London, and in Kazakhstan, I ended up with a Kazakh research assistant conducting household surveys in one of the migrant settlements on the outskirts of the city of Almaty. At that time, it was an illegal migrant settlement, officially not part of the city administration or infrastructure. The people who lived there were, in the eyes of the city officials, illegal squatters, even though this particular migrant neighborhood was one of the oldest and largest, dating from the Soviet times at the end of the 1980s, when the first waves of rural migrants began to arrive in Almaty, then the capital of Kazakhstan and its largest city. Still remains its largest city, although no longer the capital. And so that summer, every day for a couple of weeks, my assistant and I trudged around with our questionnaire surveys in Kazakh and in Russian through the dusty streets of sort of packed mud. Under the hot sun, we were barging into people's homes at all kinds of inappropriate times, basically asking rude questions about their families, their lives, their children, breaking just about every rule of Kazakh politeness and hospitality. But regardless of that, in most homes we were invited in, we were seated at the table, offered tea, and often food, and this would be a minimum prerequisite for any kind of conversation. And most people we talked to at the time moved to the city from other rural areas of Kazakhstan and told us stories of leaving mostly villages and small towns all over Kazakhstan in search of job opportunities, better schools for their children, medical care for the elderly parents. And there were especially many migrants from western Kazakhstan around the Aral Sea region, where the land and the water are polluted, and people are basically escaping an environmental disaster at this point. But it was also in that migrant settlement that I met people who told me they were Kazakh migrants from other countries who moved to Kazakhstan since independence in 1991. Some were from other countries of the former Soviet Union, mostly from Uzbekistan, but there were also many Kazakh migrants who came from China and Mongolia, and some from as far as Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and even Europe. In Kazakhstan, they're referred to as Oralman, meaning returnee, return migrant, or repatriate, in Russian, repatriant, even though most of them have never set foot in Kazakhstan before. Since the first year of independence, the government and Kazakhstan's President Nazarbayev personally have actively encouraged ethnic Kazakhs living outside the country to, as they put it, return to the land of their ancestors. They have cultivated relationships with Kazakh diaspora abroad in different countries and have considered repatriation, quote, a significant component of the national idea. So over the 20-year period that the policy of repatriation was in place between basically 1991 to 2012, approximately 1 million Kazakhs from abroad have moved to Kazakhstan, most from the countries surrounding Kazakhstan with large Kazakh populations, like Uzbekistan, Mongolia, and China. And for a country like Kazakhstan that had a population of less than 15 million people at the time of independence in 1991, 1 million is a very significant number, even just in terms of sheer demographics. During that first summit in Almaty, there was one encounter especially that I remembered, and I thought about it often when I came back 2 years later in 2006, this time to do my dissertation fieldwork, which I decided to do about Kazakh return migrants. It was during one of our routine household visits during that first summer, trying to collect information again for that survey. And this particular visit was with an elderly woman, an apa, grandmother in Kazakh, as she would be respectfully called. She told us that she moved to Kazakhstan from China just a few months earlier, as she put it, to die in the land of her ancestors. So we sat around the table in her house, sipping tea, eating bread, and at first she was quiet. She didn't really talk a lot. Was maybe a little suspicious of us, understandably, of who we were and what we were doing there. But as she started talking, she was telling us about her life. She grew more animated, and she started telling us about her mother. She said her mother was born in Kazakhstan, and in the 1920s, fled with her family across the border to China, to the Chinese Xinjiang. And this happened at the time when hundreds of thousands of other Kazakh nomads were also escaping famine, violence, expropriation of livestock, and forced sedentarization campaigns of the Soviet government in the 1920s. She herself was born in China, Apa told us, but when she was growing up, her mother told stories about her land of birth. Growing visibly emotional, the woman recalled how as a little girl she would listen to her mother's stories, her homesick descriptions of the great Kazakh steppe, the green grass, and the sharp smell of jusai, which is an aromatic wild onion that grows in the Altai region of the mountains in North Kazakhstan. Starting to cry then, Apa sang us a song, which she said her mother sang often to her when she was a little girl, Yelimai, could be translated as my people. Widely known and loved among Kazakhs in Kazakhstan and abroad, this song of lament said to have been passed down for 300 years. It is attributed to a legendary Kazakh epic singer, Kozhebirgen Zhirao, who is supposed to have lived and composed his greatest epics during the time of the Junga Wars in the 1720s and 30s. Apa went on to say how her mother never forgot about her homeland, never stopped missing it and longing for it. So her mother, now many years dead, and herself an old woman, she came here for what her mother told her about the land of her ancestors. The wide open steppe, the pure land, the blue sky of her homeland. And as she was saying this, Apa actually pointed out of the little low window set in the thick clay wall of her one-room house. As my eyes sort of followed her finger as she pointed out of the window, I looked, and all I could see were the tips of the Alatau Mountains in the distance. As usual, barely visible through a black, choking soot of Almaty's notoriously thick cloud of pollution. In 2007, Almaty made it on the list of the world's 25 dirtiest cities, ranking 9th, right below Mumbai and Baghdad. And as I looked, it seemed that nothing at that moment could be further from the images conjured by Apa so vividly from her mother's recollection of the Altan Besik, the golden cradle of her birth, the ancestral pasture lands of her Naiman clan, actually located 500 miles to the north from where we were, in a country called Kazakhstan, which did not exist at the time her mother left for China. She herself returned to the ancestral homeland she never knew and was living in an illegal migrant settlement, which, although it was home to thousands of people, did not exist on any official city map, and where one city official told us with a sigh, quote, "The state does not reach." Later, as I talked to more returned migrants from China and Mongolia, I recognized the images used by Appa: the great open steppe, the vast blue of the sky, the smell of grass, as long-standing and recurring narrative tropes and images of Kazakh poems, songs, and stories of homeland longing from China to Turkey. In 20 years of repatriation, the song Yelimai that the grandmother sang to us has been taken up as an unofficial anthem of Kazakh diaspora in return. In its numerous variations, the song is part of a larger body of Kazakh oral history and literature that recounts the time known as Kazakh as Aktaban Shuburinde Alkakoy Sulama, which could be roughly translated in English as the time when all the people with their feet worn out from running lay exhausted by the lake of grief. They describe the time in the 18th century of bitter defeats and violent displacement of Kazakh nomads from the Altai region by the Mongol Nomadic Confederation of Jungar and Oirat tribes. Embedded in songs, poems, stories, and recitations of genealogies, Aktaban Shuburinde, or the Time of Great Troubles, is a particular narrative of Kazakh history, shared among different groups of Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, China, and Mongolia. And in the 20th century, it has been carried by them in waves of migration, flights, and exiles in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and later all the way to Turkey and then to Europe. It is a particular story of the Kazakh diaspora that characterizes it as exile, loss, and displacement. Such stories of shared suffering and resistance also appeal to those who want to rethink Kazakh history as specifically national history, centered on the territory of Kazakhstan. For the Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, the Time of Great Troubles, both as an actual historical experience and as a metaphor of collective suffering, is recontextualized and reinterpreted through the narration and connection to other times and events. The Bolshevik Revolution in the 1917, the coming of the Soviet government in the 1920s, the famine years of forced sedentarization and collectivization of Kazakh nomads and the Stalinist purges of the 1930s, and then the sacrifices of the World War II years in the 1940s. In the sometimes intertwining but often divergent historical narratives told by Kazakhs in Mongolia and China, Yelimai, as a song and a lament, also weaves through the stories of the Jungar invasions, the violent years of Chinese Communist Revolution in Xinjiang, and the stories of relatives who fled from Xinjiang in the 1940s, either north to Mongolia or south, trekking on foot across the Hindu Kush Mountains into South Asia, settling in what is now Kashmir, Pakistan, and India. The song and this interview was only my first ethnographic experience of how central historical narratives were to the ways in which Kazakh returned migrants articulated their claims to belonging and homeland. I conducted 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork with Kazakh returned migrants in Almaty region of Kazakhstan in 2006 and 2007, and then 2008 and 2009. And I focused specifically on Kazakhs from Mongolia, and so I also visited Bayan-Ulgi Kazakh Autonomous District in Western Mongolia for a short research trip in July and August 2009, just to give you a brief context of my fieldwork research. Overall, my research highlights the significance of kinship and hospitality as the defining characteristics of Kazakhnas, or Kazakh Shilikh, an essential part of Kazakh nomadic heritage. I argue that more than serving simply as cultural idioms or political metaphors, ideas and practices of kinship and hospitality significantly shape the negotiations of cultural authority and legitimacy across the borders. I argue further that defying nationalizing claims, Kazakhs living in Mongolia and Mongolian Kazakhs, returned migrants in Kazakhstan, articulate conceptions of history and belonging that ignore and sometimes pointedly challenge the political configuration of the current state borders. I demonstrate how Mongolian Kazakhs articulate their ideas of homeland and belonging through appeal to ancestries, not necessarily to polities, enveloping state-sponsored notions of repatriation into a deep history of ancestral movement and seasonal migration. Such claims are predicated upon the creation and ongoing maintenance of reciprocal relationships of care among the land, the ancestors, and their descendants. For Kazakhs in Kazakhstan and Mongolia, such cyclical relationships to ancestries and movement represent very powerful, if not overtly political, forms of belonging. In this talk specifically, I want to focus on the ways in which Mongolian Kazakhs are articulating alternate conceptions of history, definitions of homeland, and competing understandings of belonging, engaging the claims of the state on their own terms. My aim is to show how people's lives are organized around principles of seasonal migration, kinship, and ancestry, as much as those of sovereignty born of citizenship claims. I argue for the viability of alternative worldviews in which the nation-state, with its ascending conceptions of history, territoriality, and membership, has become only one aspect of people's broader experiences of creating compelling and meaningful ways of life. In the rest of the talk, first, I will give a general overview of the processes of return migration in Kazakhstan and talk about how Mongolian Kazakh migration and some of the problems they face in Kazakhstan. And then I will explore alternative narrative constructions by Kazakhs in Mongolia and in Kazakhstan of a Kazakh homeland, one which is markedly not coterminous with the borders of any state. I show how, as the use of nomadic pasture lands cut through and across state borders in the last centuries, so do contemporary Kazakhs describe and justify a variety of other cultural practices, from crossing borders to obtaining legal passports, in terms of a shared Kazakh cultural history of movement. The stories people evoke and tell about the connections and Kazakhnas, Kazakhshilik, evidences the simultaneous idealization of both ancestral rootedness and mobility as fundamental to a sense of belonging to the land. So I want to start with kind of just a little bit of the history of the Mongolian Kazakh migration in the last 20 years. Most of the 120,000 Kazakhs in Mongolia live in Bayan-Ulgi Kazakh Autonomous District. Sorry about that. In Bayan-Ulgi Kazakh Autonomous District, the westernmost region of Mongolia, right across the border from Kazakhstan. Constituting about 88% of the total population in Bayan-Ulgi, they granted a degree of cultural and political autonomy there in Mongolia, and with schools, businesses, and government administration operating largely in the Kazakh language. While Mongolian Kazakhs are few compared to those living in China, Uzbekistan, or the Altai regions of Russia, all of which have close to 1 million or over 1 million Kazakhs as their population, Mongolian Kazakhs were the first to follow the call of Kazakhstan's President Nazarbayev to return to their historic homeland. Of the total 120,000 Mongolian Kazakhs, estimated 62,000, or over a half of all of them, have moved to Kazakhstan during the first 5 years of independence, 1991 through 1995. And more continue to come every year until now, even though it is no longer on a massive scale of the way it was in the first few years. Although never officially acknowledged, for Kazakhstan, one of the main motivations for the policy of repatriation in the 1990s was a perceived need to increase the number of Kazakhs. According to the last Soviet census taken in 1989, Kazakhstan entered independence with Kazakhs representing 40% and Russians 38% of the total population. In addition, outmigration of non-Kazakhs from Kazakhstan, which already started in the 1980s, reached its peak in 1992 and 1993. In the first 3 years of independence, almost 2 million people left Kazakhstan, mostly ethnic Russians, again, out of the population of less than 15 million. Especially in the early 1990s, there was a perception, therefore, of demographic crisis in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhs outside Kazakhstan were described as, quote, a demographic reserve which stabilizes the demographic situation and changes the ethnic balance, compensating for the immigration losses and ethno-demographic disproportions of the past decades, end of quote. And this is quoted from the Kazakhstan of 2007, the official conception of migration by the Kazakhstan government. From the beginning, the issue of repatriation and granting of special status to ethnic Kazakh immigrants from abroad have been central to visions of Kazakhstan's future as a nation-state of and for Kazakhs. Repatriation has been intimately tied to the claims of the political elites in which trying to legitimize themselves in promoting ambiguous, contradictory, and broadly formulated notions and policies of Kazakh national revival. By locating the ancestral homeland and situating the history of all Kazakhs within the boundaries of the modern state, Kazakhstan has actively sought a particular national legitimation. As part of this attempt to realize a new conception of the nation, therefore, President Nazarbayev in 1992 appealed to, quote, all Kazakhs to unite under a single flag on the soil of Kazakhstan, end of quote. The promotion of this idea of return migration occurred not only through official government channels, but also through nationalizing discourses, which circulated widely in Kazakh language press across the border in Mongolia in the early 1990s. For example, Diener, in his 2000 book, One Homeland or Two, The Nationalization and Transnationalization of Mongolian Kazakhs, presents a sample of articles in Kazakh newspapers circulated in Mongolia serving to promote return migration, which include titles such as, and I'm quoting some of the titles, Come to Homelands, saying, Homeland, how are you? Another one, Will all Kazakhs return to Kazakhstan? Uniqueness of our nation is our language. Come back to the homeland kinsman. Let the great migration never stop, and so on. It is therefore the very practices of the state that made it possible for many returnees to imagine and act on the conflation of just created state of Kazakhstan with the ancestral homeland. By identifying the migrants as quote-unquote repatriates, the government is claiming them as unquestioned members of the nation, constructing the political, social, and moral parameters and interpretations of their return. Because over much of the 20th century, Mongolian Kazakhs typically located the ancestral homeland in the Altai, a region which is currently divided between Kazakhstan, Russia, Mongolia, and China. Their notions of homeland were situated around seasonal pastures and ancestral migration routes that crisscrossed the Altai region in western Mongolia and Xinjiang. As the result of the nationalizing politics of the state, Kazakhs in Kazakhstan and Mongolia, as well as in northwestern China, have been thrown into conversation about what it means to be truly Kazakh and have to contend with an alternate definition of homeland. And over the last 2 decades, it has become increasingly clear that this repatriation, initially envisioned by many of its proponents in both Mongolia and in Kazakhstan as the fulfillment of Kazakh national destiny, has in the process become something quite different. Claims of national belonging and shared history centered on Kazakhstan territory are being challenged in the very practices of migration and resettlement that meant to affirm it. Rather than a single mass exodus, for example, Mongolian Kazakhs have been transforming the process of repatriation into cross-border migration, moving between Mongolia and Kazakhstan on a regular basis and maintaining dense community connections and kin ties on both sides of the border. Moreover, once in Kazakhstan, much of the ambitious promise of government support with money, housing, jobs, and so on for the returned migrants has pretty much failed to materialize, at least for most people. Throughout the 1990s, most returned Kazakhs continued to linger in a bureaucratic limbo, while their applications for Kazakhstani citizenships were taking years to process. Over 90% of Mongolian Kazakhs did not receive their Kazakhstan citizenship until the year 2000, for many of them already 10 years after they have moved to Kazakhstan. The central government continued to officially encourage repatriation. However, local government officials described their work with repatriates in terms of efforts to, on the other hand, limit, control, and organize what for them was a chaotic and overwhelming migration process on the local level. Thus, the story of a diasporic return to an ancestral homeland has pretty much resulted in a breakdown between state policies and local priorities, and has provoked radical new discussions of what constitutes claims to identity, belonging, and citizenship on an intensely local level, as well as across the borders of Inner-Asia. And in this context, Mongolian Kazakhs specifically hold a very special place in the national imagination of Kazakhs. A widespread perception in Kazakhstan is that the returnees from Mongolia are the poorest, the most backward, as well as the purest and most traditional of all Kazakhs. This view was exemplified very early on. For example, when at the first official World Council of Kazakhs in 1992, President Nazarbayev officially acknowledged the Kazakh community in Mongolia as, quote, having enabled the retention of traditional Kazakh culture and language to a far greater degree than any other Kazakh community in the world, including that of the former Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, end of quote. In Kazakhstan, Oralman and return migration was a topic that invariably elicited spirited conversations, passionate debates, and sometimes heated disagreements among locals in Kazakhstan, whether they were ethnically Kazakh or Russian or anyone else, whenever I brought this up as the topic of my research. And since the beginning, the official rhetoric of welcoming the co-ethnics home has been fraught with ambiguities and controversies. And what has become finally known as, quote-unquote, the Oralman problem has created divisions even among Kazakhstani Kazakhs that were in the beginning quite sympathetic to the idea. One commonly held opinion is that Kazakhstan does have a responsibility to help Kazakhs in Mongolia and other countries seen as our blood relatives, Kandastar, through the notion of shared ancestry of a unified Kazakh people. For many people involved in repatriation efforts in the newly independent Kazakhstan in the 1990s, the ingathering of the Kazakh diaspora represented a redress of past historic wrongs of the colonial Russian and Soviet past, as well as the future hope of the Kazakh nation. The other, sharply dissenting position, shared by many Kazakhstani Kazakhs, as well as Russians, is that Kazakhs living in Mongolia or China are descendants of those wealthy quote-unquote traders who fled Soviet oppression while their own ancestors have stayed and suffered. In this view, excluded from the shared history of Soviet suffering, the Kazakhstani state owes these Kazakhs nothing. Rather, these returnees are seen as a drain on the country's already overstretched resources, available to its more deserving and more genuine citizens. In this way, Mongolian Kazakhs are caught in the multiple social and political ambivalences in Kazakhstan. At the same time, the symbolic resources of authenticity and cultural legitimacy on which they can draw as authentic and traditional Kazakhs also serve as hindrances to their claim of membership in the modern state. While being an important part of the conception of the Kazakh nation, in practice, their belonging in the national community is questioned in everyday forms of social interaction. For example, just to give you an idea, a newspaper article, The Long Road Home, describes the typical predicament of Kazakh Oralman. There has appeared in Kazakhstan a new category of people who cannot be included either among locals or strangers. These are Oralman. On the one hand, arriving into the country, they receive citizenship and become our own, Svaimi. On the other, it is told about them that in the houses given to them by the state, Oralman, out of habit, keep animals and themselves prefer to live in yurts, or that they generally do not have a roof over their head and increase the ranks of the unemployed. And the author asks, what are Oralman looking for in Kazakhstan, and what does Kazakhstan expect from them? And here's an example of also some more critical coverage of some of the failures of the return migration, showing the repatriates sort of happily crossing into Kazakhstan. In turn, many repatriates also shared their ambivalent feelings of belonging and estrangement that they felt upon their arrival to their historic homeland. Many times I heard Mongolian Kazakhs refer to themselves as second-class citizens. And in a conversation with a young woman journalist who was herself a Mongolian Kazakh, she stated, quote, "We are like a diaspora in our own homeland. Oralman are a social stratum. These other nationalities already adopted here as Kazakhstanis, but not Oralman. Adaptation is a long-term process. It will not take 10, not even 50 years for Oralman to adopt. And the state policy doesn't integrate the nation, but on the contrary, divides." And this was a critique that was quite common. I want to, in the second part of the talk, want to focus on some of the ideas of ancestry, genealogy, history, and belonging that Mongolian Kazakhs articulate as well in Kazakhstan and in Mongolia. Many people who moved to Kazakhstan as adults express their continued attachment to Mongolia, even as they acknowledge that their children and grandchildren are coming to increasingly identify with Kazakhstan as their home. As they hotly contest this Oralman label and all the forms of stigmatized differentiation it currently implies in Kazakhstan, they're compelled to continuously recreate their sense of belonging and press their claims to entitlement in a state through counter-narrative strategies of their own. These strategies seek to subvert the different claims of disconnection with Kazakhstan suggested by their returnee and diaspora label by emphasizing alternate conceptions of Kazakh history and definitions of homeland. Rather than seeing themselves in diasporic terms, implying a sense of displacement and disconnect from their homeland, they simultaneously evoke both ancestral rootedness and mobility as fundamental to a sense of belonging and to shared ancestry. For example, one elderly Mongolian Kazakh man, now living in Kazakhstan, framed the story of his life in the culturally familiar narrative of Zhetayata, or seven ancestors. That is, reciting the names of the 7 generations of his patrilineal ancestors, and naming and describing specific places and landmarks that marked their migration routes and seasonal pastures. Quote, "We lived on the land of our ancestors, where they have been since ancient times, more than 700 years ago, on the Altai at the Baintao, name of the mountain. Over there's a small place called Dayin, located by the lake Surgamde and the river Kobda, Sarsambia, where lived the grandfather of my father, Kuzdey. Our ancestors wintered on the southern slope of the mountains. Later, those territories became Chinese, and in the summer, they rode out to the summer pastures at the northern slopes, which now belong to Mongolia. I, in a sense, do not consider myself an Oralman, a returnee, who returned to his homeland in Kazakhstan, insofar as we lived on the lands of our ancestors. My ancestors, whose names I know up to the 7th generation, were well-known people. My great-grandfathers in the 5th generation, Mami, Beis, were judges, B. My great-grandfather Baidali built a madrasa, a school, near a Buddhist monastery where Kazakh children were taught. By framing his story in this way, he ascertained that his ancestors have lived in Western Mongolia for the past 700 years, and so he should not be called an Oralman, literally a returnee, a label he and many other Mongolian Kazakhs greatly resented. It allowed him to question the conflation of Kazakh homeland with the current political borders of Kazakhstan, and to dismiss an accusation frequently expressed by the other locals that Kazakhs from other countries abandoned the ancestral homeland in times of need and are now returning only in search of economic prosperity and an easy life. His story, like many others, told by Kazakhs across the Altai, connect current populations with ancestral names and places through narrating histories of movement that ignore and sometimes pointedly challenge the political configuration of the current state borders. So most scholars describe Kazakhs as relatively recent arrivals to Mongolia, with documented migration and settlement dating back to the collapse of the Oirat-Jungar Confederation in the 1860s. Sorry, that should be 1760s. The assistance that the Kazakhs gave to the Manchurian state against the Jungars led to the granting of grazing rights and incorporation of Western Mongolian pasture lands into the grazing cycles that encompassed what is today northeastern Kazakhstan and northwestern China. Nevertheless, many Mongolian Kazakhs assert a much longer, at least a millennium-old presence in Mongolia and western China. Reaching back to the times of Chinggis Khan, they claim that Naiman, Kere, and Merkit, which are the names of the tribes, recorded in the secret history of the Mongols as their direct Kazakh ancestors. Some have described the current presence of Kazakhs in Western Mongolia as part of a movement of Chinggis Khan's armies from the regions of Ulaanbaatar in the east westward, as evidenced by the presence of what they consider Kazakh artifacts and place names scattered across central and western Mongolia. As Diener argues, such constructions of historical links among imagined ancestors, current populations, and the land they continue to occupy counterpose the homeland conceptions of Kazakhs in Mongolia to those in Kazakhstan. When recounting their own personal or family histories, many Kazakhs from Mongolia emphasize their strong sense of attachment to Bayan-Ulgi as their land of birth, Tuganjir, and as a part of a larger territory of ancestral movement and seasonal migration. Stories told by Kazakhs across the Altai connect current populations with ancestral names and places. Sorry, I already said that. Through narrating histories of movement that often ignore and sometimes pointedly challenge the political configuration of the current state borders. I guess doesn't hurt to reinstate. Significantly, the territory of contemporary the territory of contemporary Kazakhstan plays no role in most people's descriptions of the ancestral and family histories. Mongolian Kazakhs narrate the more recent history of the region in terms of the cross-cutting of political borders that have fragmented the integrated geographical and social field of Kazakh seasonal movement and dispersed kinship networks. Large political events of the 20th century, like the closing of international borders between Mongolia, China, and the Soviet Union, the tumultuous political history of Xinjiang in the 1930s and 1940s, the establishment of the socialist government in Mongolia, all of these are narrated as intimate family histories of flight, displacement, separation, and loss. Mongolian Kazakhs assert cultural and linguistic continuity and genealogical kinship with other Kazakhs, usually expressed through the notions of common descent and blood ties. At the same time, it is very important for many people to highlight and maintain the identification as explicitly Mongolian, or Kiri Kazakhs, Kiri being the name of the specific Ru or the specific lineage that most of Mongolian Kazakhs belong to, with their own distinct histories and specific genealogies, different from those of other Kazakhs in Kazakhstan. In the summer of 2009, one man in Ulgi, the main town in Bayan-Ulgi, enthusiastically described his search for funding in an attempt to start his own non-governmental organization, with the goal to, quote, collect and preserve spiritual heritage of Kazakhs in Mongolia. Rizbek Aga, as his name was, began with talking at length about the changes Kazakh community in Bayan-Ulgi has undergone since the beginning of migration to Kazakhstan 20 years earlier. Like other Kazakhs in Bayan-Ulgi, he lamented the loss of many cultural institutions and professionals, artists, and culture workers that were involved in them, most of them leaving for Kazakhstan in the first few years of independence, such as almost the entire troupe of the Ulgi Kazakh Drama Theater. The building is still there, but all of the artists have since then immigrated to Kazakhstan. When I asked Rizbek Agha about the history of Kazakhs in Mongolia, he got very excited because, as many Mongolian Kazakhs, he's an enthusiastic amateur historian. So he ripped out a sheet of notebook paper and quickly sketched out an outline of a map on which, with a flourish of arrows, he inscribed the movement of Kazakhs across the mountains and steppes of Inner Asia. And he began to explain. Before, all around Altai was Kazakh land. There were no borders among Kazakhs. Then borders were made by Russia and China, and Kazakhs got separated and forgot their language and culture because they had no contact with each other. They, he means the Kiri Kazakhs, were with Chinggis Khan, mentioned in the secret history. Near Ulaanbaatar, there is a mountain. This was Kiri land, under Kiri Khan named Turul Khan. Kazakhs had no single government. Each had their own Khan. But there, near Ulaanbaatar, that was Kiri land. That's why they have so many Kiri stone monuments near Ulaanbaatar. There were Naiman, there were Kiri, Konrad with Chinggis Khan, all Ortajus, the middle horde of the Kazakh tribal confederations. This Altai mountain area belongs to the Kiri and the Naiman. It was all land of the middle horde clans. Hanti is Chinggis Khan's land of birth. Before Chinggis Khan, only that was their land. Later, Chinggis Khan started fighting with all his neighbors, and Kazakhs began moving further west, being pushed away. So that's sort of his version of history. He continued with a detailed description of the westward movement of Kiri Kazakhs for the next several hundred years, eventually ending up in what is currently the territory of Kazakhstan. He concluded, and after the Jungars destroyed Chinggis Khan, they came back again, closer to what their own Mongolian land was. So they moved all around and came back again. Finally, he reflected on the ambiguity of homeland and the ambivalence of return, currently facing Mongolian Kazakhs contending with multiple and competing ideas of history and belonging. Now, this is my opinion, he says. Maybe it is not right, but I'm only expressing my own opinion. Migration, koshikon, is right. But not all Kazakhs are leaving. It is not for all Kazakhs. We're living in our own land. We're moving around in our own land. We're moving around in our own land just as we always used to. Winter, summer, and autumn. It's just now we're crossing borders. In this way, Rizbek Agha situates contemporary patterns of cross-migration or cross-border migration within the historic pattern of ancestors, both warriors and nomads. His stories both identify and explain a historic division between Kazakh populations in the east and west. In the west, at least, all these ancestors and their current descendants rightly belong on their own land. In this view, movement becomes not one-directional or exceptional, but rather ongoing and cyclical. migration is not a problem to be resolved, but a pattern and a deeply held way of life. For many people in Kazakhstan, the fact that some Mongolian Kazakhs returned to Mongolia, many moved between Mongolia and Kazakhstan several times, and some also retained both Mongolian and Kazakhstani passports illegally, serves as a proof of their disloyalty and their duplicitous character. People frequently cite numerous newspaper articles or locally circulating stories, at least they did to me, knowing that that was my topic of research, in which Mongolian Kazakhs are represented not only as unfairly benefiting from government assistance, often unavailable to locals, but also as collecting the money and then leaving for Mongolia. Mongolian Kazakhs, on the other hand, make sense of such processes in the context of Kazakh history, again, as that of dwelling through moving. The term kashikon, usually glossed as migration of movement in English, is used by Kazakhs in Mongolia and in Kazakhstan to describe both the cyclical movement of Kazakh nomadic households along the regular routes between seasonal pastures and the current processes of cross-border migration to Kazakhstan. Thus, Mongolian Kazakhs describe and justify a variety of practices, from receiving government assistance to obtaining illegal passports, in terms of a shared Kazakh cultural history of movement, where kinship and hospitality are seen as the defining characteristics of Kazakhnas. Pointing out the relatively small amount of money given through the government migration assistance program, Mongolian Kazakhs argue that such assistance was significant largely for, quote, moral and psychological rather than material reasons to show that Kazakhstan helps us, end of quote. One Mongolian Kazakh explained that, quote, our Kazakhs understand the quota as yerulik. It means, the word yerulik means a meal or a feast organized in honor of the neighbors who arrived late to the jailao, to the summer pasture. When everyone has already set up the yurts, the people who get there late get yerulik. That's how he explained it. Thus, unlike many government officials and other locals who often talk about assistance as undeserved government handout, Mongolian Kazakhs see government assistance in terms of a practice of hospitality that affirms the bonds of kinship and maintains traditional relations of reciprocity among neighbors and kin. Kazakhstan actively attempts to construct Mongolian Kazakhs as its national diaspora and to regulate their cross-border movement as an orderly process of permanent mass repatriation. But the failure of such explanations to effectively capture the practical actualities of migration processes and people's understandings of them is reflected in a question another Mongolian Kazakh man rhetorically posed to me at the end of a long interview I had with him, where I questioned him for about an hour. I think finally he got tired and he said, now I will ask you a question. If a person who goes to Kazakhstan is an oralman, a returnee, what is the term for people who go to Kazakhstan and come back to Mongolia? What do you call them? And so I want to move on to my conclusion, leaving you with that question. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk briefly about some of the more recent changes concerning the repatriation program. Since I came back from Kazakhstan in 2010, the program, which was renamed in 2006 as Nurli Kush, the Blessed Migration, was actually officially suspended by the decree of President Nazarbayev in February 2012, almost 20 years after it began. I'm actually only mentioning this in the conclusion now because I'm really still trying to figure out what to do with that idea, with that fact. The official government announcement back in April of 2012 stated that the program is only temporarily suspended and will be reopened again after a thorough reform. I don't know personally, obviously, but I do think that it's unlikely the program will reopen. Or if it will, it'll probably be very curtailed and much more limited than it is now. The suspension of the program came right immediately after, in the wake of tragic events in the town of Zhanaozen, in an oil-producing Mangistau region in western Kazakhstan, right by the Caspian Sea. This is where the biggest oil deposits in Kazakhstan are, and basically over 90% of the local economy relies in one way or another on the oil business. Main companies being involved there are Tengiz and Chevron oil corporations and Kazakhstan state's subsidiary company, Kazmunay Gas. Thousands of, basically, and very briefly, recap a really complicated story. Thousands of local oil workers were involved in a protest and a strike against the companies for more fair wages and working conditions, and also after about 10,000 of them got laid off. And some of them were fired because they were protesting. And the workers and their demands were pretty much ignored by the companies as well as the government, while the workers camped out for over 7 months, from May through December of 2011, at the central square in front of the government building in the town of Zhanaozen. So I cannot really go into details of what happened. Nobody really knows what happened, probably, but the details are unclear. But on December 16th, which is the day of independence in Kazakhstan, there were some clashes of the striking oil workers with the police. More police and military were called in. The violence escalated over 1 or 2 days. The official death toll ended up with being 15 dead, all of them oil workers, and over 100 injured, again, the vast majority of them being oil workers, not the police. The police, some of the political protests in Kazakhstan after that accused police of brutality and deadly violence against innocent people and peaceful protesters. In turn, the government said that the police fired in self-defense, and President Nazarbayev visited the region about 3 days after and declared that the riots were instigated by hooligans and drunks. What came as a surprise to me in relation to our topic today of the returned migrants is that during the time immediately after the events, President Nazarbayev and a number of other high-ranking Kazakhstani government officials directly blamed the Oralman, the returned migrants, as a group for the unrest and the violence in Mangistau. And the president talked about Zhanaozen as, quote, the culmination of mistakes in migration policy, unquote. The Oralman were referred to, again, quote, not simply a vulnerable social group, but a very real risk factor carrying a threat to the internal political stability in the country, end of quote. And during the official news briefings, again, in the next couple of days after these events, top government officials like Vice Minister of Labor and Social Protection, Nurimbetov, and others remarked that over a quarter of all oil workers fired by the company for protesting wages and work conditions were Oralman. And that in the subsequent trials of the Zhanaozen affair, it became known that out of 37 people accused at the trials of violence during those 2 days, 20 were Oralman, right? So out of 37 accused, 20 were Oralman. How did this happen? Zhanaozen made partly visible some of the rifts and problems that were already existing for over 20 years, specifically. For the returned migrants, the Mangistau region and Zhanaozen specifically became known in Kazakhstan as the informal capital of Oralman, because by official statistics, out of 1 million returned migrants, 1 out of every 10, close to 100,000 people eventually ended up in Mangistau region for work, basically. And the population of Zhanaozen town itself doubled from 60,000 to about 120 to 130,000 in just over 10 years. So there were a lot of problems, not only with the monopoly of the oil companies over the local economy, which has a host of its own problems, but also with social tensions, competition over housing, jobs, and so on in the Mangistau region and in Zhanaozen among the locals and the returned migrants. Later on, again, in the wake of the events, the government also held the Oralman generally responsible for fomenting political unrest, compromising the security of the state, and engaging in religious extremism and terrorist acts, all claimed to be on the rise in Kazakhstan over the last 2 years, in what I would argue is a rising authoritarianism and further political and religious freedoms in the country. And so after 20 years, the program that was quite vocally and actively supported by the government was quietly suspended without even making an announcement about it officially until months later that I found out. People who were left waiting for citizenship applications that were in the process now are sort of, it's not clear what's happening to them. Everything's been suspended. I've heard some news organizations saying that there is several thousand, 17,000 to 20,000 migrants waiting for their citizenship applications to be processed, and they just sort of suspended everything without prior notice, and it's not clear what will happen to them. Again, from here, it's hard to tell what's going on. And I think without clear directives from the central government right now, the local governments are just waiting to see what to do, and nobody's given them any specific direction, so everything is sort of up in the air. And so the story of a diaspora, I mean, I'm not sure what this means and whether we can argue that the return migration is over or not. I plan to go back this summer to see what is going on and how Mongolian Kazakhs that I know and other return migrants are coping with the situation. I heard some are going back to Mongolia, but I want to find out what's going on with that, and if there are people going back, why and how many. And so hopefully I will have a better idea of what's going on, since I haven't been back for over 2 years. And also, just as a final thought, building directly on this research, I'm looking to start a new project, looking more broadly at social justice, governance, and political activism in Kazakhstan. Again, hopefully when I come back. Specifically, at this I'm interested in looking at the concept of iman, which is a word borrowed in Kazakh from Arabic, meaning morality or faith, and kind of the idiom of Muslimness and Kazakhness, and how that relates to the ideas of democracy in Kazakhstan, and again, political activism and social justice and so on. Hopefully to expand their understanding of what constitutes political behavior by examining what is left out of many of the state-centered approaches to Central Asian politics. And I think I will finish that. And if you have any questions or comments, I would greatly appreciate it. Thanks.